My name is Julianne Mercer, and I was 34 years old the afternoon I laid to rest the only man who ever truly raised me. His name was Arthur Vance. He was my grandfather, and he was the one who taught me how to align a delicate clock gear, balance a ledger, and stand firm when the world tried to sweep me away. At his memorial, 2 seats in the very front row remained completely unoccupied. They were the seats I had personally reserved for my parents, who never bothered to board their flight. But it was the photograph they posted online exactly 3 hours later, and the text message that flashed onto my screen from my deceased grandfather's phone, where this story actually begins. Welcome back to Their Secret Stories. This is the channel where we sit with the quiet betrayals that fester inside families and the women who finally refuse to shrink themselves just to keep a fragile peace. If a story of this weight has ever echoed in your own home, you already know how heavy an empty chair can feel. Drop a comment below and make sure to subscribe. I remember standing near the altar of that small, dim chapel, watching the pews fill with the people who had truly known him. Neighbors he'd helped, former clients from his clock repair shop, a man he had taught to build a backyard deck back in the 90s. Everyone arrived except the 2 individuals who carried his DNA and shared my last name. And then, right there in the quiet of the chapel, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out, and the floor beneath my feet seemed to dissolve. To understand why that vibration shook me to my core, you have to understand the man lying in the polished box at the front of the sanctuary. My parents vanished when I was 8 years old. Victor and Helen Mercer had grand plans, apparently, and a young daughter was simply baggage they didn't care to carry. They discarded me like a worn-out winter coat, so Arthur opened his doors. He was 53 then, a quiet watchmaker with the scent of machine oil and brass polish permanently etched into the lines of his hands. He didn't offer a single complaint or sigh. He simply cleared out his guest bedroom, put clean sheets on the bed, and bought a nightlight shaped like a star to keep the shadows away. And he showed up for everything. Every school play where I froze and forgot my lines. Every spelling bee where I choked on the final word. Every single parent-teacher conference. Sitting uncomfortably in those tiny plastic chairs designed for 7-year-olds. His tall frame bent double as he scribbled notes on the back of a creased hardware store receipt. My mother occasionally sent a generic card on my birthday, usually a week late. Arthur never missed a single day. When I was 10, I asked him through tears why my parents didn't want me. He set down his magnifying visor, looked at me with those steady gray eyes, and said something I would carry with me into adulthood. Being there is the whole battle. Quiet girl, he told me. Everything else is just background static. Love isn't a grand speech. It's a silhouette standing in the doorway. And for more than 25 years, he was that silhouette. He walked me down the aisle when I married David. He cradled my daughter Maya just an hour after she entered the world, letting his tears fall freely onto her soft blanket. So no, there was never any confusion in my mind about who my real family was. Which is why those final, agonizing weeks of his life, when he needed me more than ever, still haunt my sleepless nights. My biggest regret is that I didn't see the trap early enough. The cancer took his lungs, an aggressive, ruthless kind that offered no room for negotiation. By the time autumn arrived, the treatments had stripped away his strength, leaving him frail and breathless. Every evening, after wrapping up the bookkeeping for the local shops in town, numbers are my trade after all, and I keep my ledgers precise. I would drive the 20 minutes to his house. I'd prepare hot broth he could barely swallow, and we'd sit together watching old reruns. And that was when my mother, Helen, suddenly reappeared. She lived in San Diego and only ever materialized when there was an asset to liquidate or a check to cash. Now, she flew in under the guise of caring for her dear father. Almost instantly, she took control. She intercepted his mail. She locked down his banking. When I offered to sit down at the kitchen table and organize his accounts, which is literally what I do for a living, she gave me that sharp, frosty smile of hers. "Father wants his peace, Julianne," she said. "He doesn't want people prying." I pushed back. I asked to be added as a joint observer to monitor his accounts for potential fraud, the standard precaution any financial professional would take. She claimed he had arranged everything exactly how he wanted it, and that it wasn't my place to interfere. And here is the detail I keep dissecting. I was highly suspicious. I asked the right questions. I even went so far as to call his local branch. But the manager informed me that they could only discuss the accounts with Arthur himself or his legally designated power of attorney. And the name on that document was Helen. They had built a wall of paperwork around a dying man, and it bore my mother's signature. Legally, I was locked out. I tried to soothe my anxiety. I told myself she was his biological daughter. I told myself that the impending grief was making me paranoid. So I delivered his broth, kept my head down, and made the mistake of trusting the law to protect him. 3 weeks later, he was gone, and I still didn't know what she had been hiding behind that artificial smile. He passed away on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was there, holding his left hand, while a hospice nurse named Rosemary held his right. Helen had flown back to Southern California 4 days prior because, and I am quoting her directly, she couldn't just sit around wasting her vacation waiting for the inevitable. So, I coordinated the funeral entirely on my own. I selected the music. I drafted the obituary at my kitchen table at 3 a.m. while David slept upstairs. I coordinated with the chapel, the florist, and the cemetery staff. And then I dialed my mother to give her the details. There was a long silence on her end, punctuated by the distinct sound of splashing water and laughter in the background. She calmly explained that they wouldn't be able to make it. Flights were far too expensive on short notice. She was sure Arthur would understand. They would say a quiet prayer on the coast instead. I held the dead phone to my ear for a long, cold minute after she disconnected. I pictured Arthur sitting in that tiny child's chair at my school events. I pictured the scrap paper he used to write down every detail of my life. Being there is the whole battle. Quiet girl. The words beat inside my chest like a drum. Yet his own flesh and blood couldn't bother to book a flight. Something inside me went completely silent. It was the absolute quiet you experience when a spreadsheet refuses to balance, no matter how many times you recalculate the columns. I convinced myself that leaving 2 empty chairs at their father's memorial was the absolute worst they could do. I believed a daughter abandoning her father's grave was the absolute bottom of the pit. I was incredibly wrong. The real betrayal was already loaded and waiting on a beach in Cabo San Lucas. The service took place on a damp, gray Saturday. The sky was heavy with unshed rain. I arrived early and placed programs on those 2 front row chairs. I don't know why. Hope is an incredibly stubborn thing. I set them down like place cards for ghosts, hoping against hope that she would prove me wrong. The chapel filled up behind me. When I finally turned around, my throat tightened because the space was overflowing. There was the Alvarez family, whose grandfather, Clock Arthur, had repaired for free after their basement flooded. There was elderly Mr. Harrison, weeping openly into a handkerchief. There was a young woman I'd never met, who whispered to me that Arthur had trained her husband in his craft and saved their family from bankruptcy. Half the community showed up for a retired watchmaker, while 2 empty seats sat in the front row. The pastor spoke. Rosemary, the nurse, offered a reassuring squeeze of my shoulder. I stepped up to the podium to read the eulogy I'd written in the dark. My voice remained steady, because Arthur's granddaughter does not break down in front of a crowd. He had built me stronger than that. I returned to my seat. I cast one final glance at those 2 vacant chairs, and that was the exact second the phone in my black coat pocket vibrated. I hesitated, then pulled it out. It was an image. My mother wearing a bright orange sundress, smiling with a tropical cocktail in her hand. Behind her, my father stood grinning, his face sunburned and smug. White sand and ocean blue so vibrant it looked painted. And underneath, a caption in her familiar, breezy font, living our absolute best life. It had been posted publicly, timestamped exactly 11 minutes after the memorial service had begun. My fingers went numb around the glass screen. I don't remember the rest of the service. My next clear memory is sitting in the driver's seat of my car in the empty church parking lot, staring at that bright, sun-drenched image until the display went black. I would wake it up, stare again, and watch it dim. Living our absolute best life. They were celebrating their freedom while I watched his casket lowered into the earth. In my career, I am paid to remain perfectly calm in the face of other people's financial catastrophes. A missing invoice, a depleted budget, a panicked business owner facing an audit. I am the anchor. I am the one who says, let's look at the hard data. But sitting in that cold car, I couldn't find a single rational thought. I kept calculating the timing. She posted the image 11 minutes into the service. That meant while we were singing his favorite hymn, she was adjusting filters, typing out her caption, and choosing her layout. It wasn't an oversight. It was a deliberate statement. I was still staring at the screen when the phone vibrated again. A text message from a contact saved under a single, sacred word grandpa, his number. The line that had gone dark on Tuesday afternoon when Rosemary drew the sheet up and my world stopped spinning. Now, it illuminated the dark interior of my car as if nothing had changed. Quiet girl, go to my workshop right now. I read the words 4 times. My grandfather was resting in the cold ground behind me. I had watched him take his last breath. There was no logical explanation for why his phone would be sending me instructions. The chill that crept up my arms was absolute. I looked back toward the cemetery gates, then down at his name glowing in the dark car, and I did the only thing Arthur Vance's granddaughter could do. I turned the ignition. Arthur's house sat 20 minutes north of the county line, down a narrow dirt road where the gravel rattled against the underside of the car. I made the drive in 12. My hands were shaking against the steering wheel, the radio turned completely off. I tried to reason with myself. A delayed message, a system error, a cruel prank. But when I pulled up, the porch light was burning brightly, the front door was unlocked, and a car I recognized was parked in the driveway. I walked up the wooden steps, the same steps he and I had stained together when I was 11 years old. Inside, sitting at the pine kitchen table, was a broad-shouldered man in his late 60s, his reading glasses propped on his forehead, holding my grandfather's phone. It was Warren Cole. Arthur's attorney for nearly 3 decades and his closest friend. He stood up when he saw my pale face. Julianne, I am so incredibly sorry, he said softly. I should have used my own phone, but your grandfather made me promise. He knew you would come for him. I couldn't find my voice. Warren laid the phone down gently as if it were fragile. Arthur asked me to do this. Months ago, he made me swear that the day after he passed, I would get you out here completely alone by whatever means necessary. He told me to use his number because he said she'll drop the entire world for that name. I stared at the black screen, then at the empty chair at the head of the table. My heart didn't just ache, it felt as though it had fallen clean through the floorboards. This wasn't a digital glitch. It wasn't a ghost. It was Arthur Vance reaching across the threshold of death to guide me, which meant he had known exactly what was coming. Warren adjusted his glasses. "There's a box," he murmured. He wanted you to have it. It was an old wooden watchmaker's component box, the kind he used to store spare gears and spring pins, with my name written across the top in his thick, permanent marker. Inside were 3 distinct items: a journal with a faded navied blue cover, its corners worn thin; a substantial stack of bank statements, sorted and secured with paperclips by month; and a legal document I recognized instantly because I had analyzed dozens of them for clients, a durable power of attorney. Helen's signature was scrawled on the line designating her as his agent. I looked up at Warren. He slowly folded his hands on the table. "Your grandfather didn't trust his daughter," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Not at the end. He wanted you to have the hard facts, Julianne, not just the sorrow. He said you were the only person in this family who actually understood how to read the numbers, and the only one who ever truly showed up." I touched the worn navy cover of the journal. I could feel the physical indentations where his failing hand had pressed the pen deep into the paper. I didn't open it yet. I wasn't strong enough. But holding that small wooden box, I knew my life had just fractured into a distinct before and after. And there was no going back. If you have ever been handed deep grief and legal paperwork in the exact same breath, you know how hard it can be to breathe. Stay with me, because this is the exact moment I stopped being the quiet girl who kept the peace. Comment: being there. If you have someone in your life who always stood by you, and make sure to subscribe, because what I found inside those pages is the exact reason my mother is where she is today. I placed the lid back on the wooden box, thanked Warren, and drove home with the navy blue journal sitting on the passenger seat like a live wire. David was waiting up when I arrived. Maya was asleep, and the porch light had been left on for me, just as Arthur had always left his. David took one look at my face, saw the wooden box under my arm, and quietly put the kettle on the stove without asking a single question. He is a good man. A plumber who spends his days repairing broken lines and desperately wants the rest of the world to be fixable, too. I told him about the photograph on the beach. I told him about the text message from his dead father, in Law's phone. He sat down heavily at the table. Then I opened the journal. Arthur's handwriting had always been solid and precise, the hand of a man who worked with calipers and microscopic gears. But as the pages progressed, the script began to waver, the lines loosening as the illness robbed him of his physical control. The initial entries were simple logs of his daily struggles. Bad night. Rosemary adjusted the oxygen flow. Julianne brought homemade broth. Stayed to watch the movie. Then, several weeks in, the writing grew anxious. Money is disappearing from the account, he wrote. and I don't understand why. Helen says I spent it on additional care. Maybe I did, I get so confused. My mind feels foggy. I read that specific sentence 3 times. My grandfather had never lost track of a single penny in his entire life. He kept every receipt in labeled metal tins by decade. Yet here he was in his own handwriting, questioning his sanity while his daughter convinced him he was simply wasting his savings. David read over my shoulder, his posture freezing. The kettle on the stove began to whistle, but neither of us moved. Somewhere in these pages lay the blueprint of the theft that had isolated my grandfather. I turned to the next page. My hands had stopped shaking. Numbers are the one domain where I never lose my composure, and Arthur, thankfully, had started tracking his own data. The middle section of the journal was where a vulnerable man transformed into an investigator. After his first major hospital stay, Arthur wrote that Helen had sat him down, claiming his cognitive faculties were slipping, that he was no longer capable of managing his own affairs, and that she needed to assume the burden. She had presented the durable power of attorney papers the morning after a brutal treatment had left him too weak to even lift his teacup. He had signed because she was his daughter, because he was exhausted and terrified, and because a father desperately wants to believe his child is offering support rather than pickpocketing him. Then the pages turned into a ledger. 500 withdrawn on the 11th, he noted. Purchased nothing. 700 on the 18th. Rosemary picked up the prescriptions. 45. That was my total expenditure for the week. He had begun to spot the discrepancies. Even in his final, weakest months, he kept a secret tally because the man who knew how to balance a clock mechanism knew when things were out of alignment. She thinks I am too weak to notice, he wrote near the middle of the journal. I am not. I just have no way to stop her. The bank refuses to speak to me. They will only speak to her. And beneath that, the ink pressed so hard it nearly punctured the paper, I gave her the key to my home. And she took everything else. I closed the journal and turned to the stack of bank statements Warren had provided. My grandfather had left me a map. All I had to do was follow the coordinates. I laid the paper, clipped statements across our dining room table, arranging them chronologically, and began the process of a forensic audit. To most people, this kind of work is tedious. To me, it is the ultimate truth. Numbers don't take sides. They don't pretend to love you, and they don't fabricate excuses. They simply present the reality of what occurred. And the reality of what happened to Arthur Vance was printed in cold, black ink. Starting almost immediately after the power of attorney was executed, significant funds began leaving his accounts in structured intervals. These weren't medical bills. I cross-referenced every hospital invoice and pharmacy receipt, which were entirely separate. These were direct electronic transfers, moving steadily from his account into a destination account ending in the same 4 digits. Some months it was $4,000. Other months it was upwell thousand, notated as personal loans or administrative reimbursements, though there was absolutely no record of Helen ever purchasing a single item for his comfort. And every few weeks, his hard-earned savings were quietly routed to an account in San Diego. I built a spreadsheet, tracking the dates and the amounts, watching the cumulative total rise like a fever chart in the right-hand column. David kept me supplied with coffee, staying silent as the night wore on. He knows the expression I get when the data begins to construct a narrative. At 2 a.m, I leaned back, pressing my palms against the table. Grief makes you second, guess your own senses. It makes you wonder if you are overreacting, if you are letting anger cloud your judgment. But spreadsheets don't experience grief. They simply accumulate data. And the data was rising far faster than I had anticipated. Before taking any legal action, I chose to call her. I felt I owed myself that final confirmation. I wanted to hear her attempt to explain it. The next morning, I sat in the front seat of my car so Maya wouldn't hear the conversation and dialed her number. Helen answered, her voice light and cheerful, clearly still enjoying her coastal vacation. I kept my tone completely flat. I told her I had been organizing Arthur's financial records, that there were several large withdrawals I couldn't account for, and asked her directly what those transfers to her personal account represented. The warmth vanished from the line instantly. That is absolutely none of your concern, she snapped. It is my concern, I replied, considering I am the one organizing his estate. She let out a harsh, mocking laugh. His estate, his affairs are family business, Julianne. And last I checked, you aren't actually family, are you? I remained silent, letting her speak. When you are auditing someone, you always let them keep talking until they dig their own grave. He felt sorry for you. She continued, her voice dripping with venom. That's all it ever was. You want the real truth. You were nothing but his charity case, Julianne. Not his actual blood. His blood is me, and what was his belongs to me. Then she hung up. I sat in the driveway with the phone in my lap for a long time. Charity case. Not his blood. She had delivered the exact weapon she believed would shatter my resolve. The phrase designed to make me retreat, to make me feel small and powerless. 20 years ago, it might have worked, but I wasn't that vulnerable child anymore, and I had a spreadsheet inside that didn't care about DNA. I walked back into the house, picked up the journal, and contacted Warren. I asked him to explain the legal parameters of a power of attorney as if he were explaining them to a prosecutor. We met at his office, a quiet space filled with old law volumes. A power of attorney, Warren explained, lean and serious, does not grant ownership. It establishes a fiduciary responsibility. That is the critical distinction. Helen was legally bound to act solely in Arthur's best financial interests, not her own. Every single dollar she transferred had to be directly tied to his care, his housing, or his bills. She could not legally transfer those funds to her own account as a personal gift or unauthorized reimbursement. Doing so is not a simple family dispute. Julianne, it is a severe breach of fiduciary duty, and given the scale of the funds, the state classifies it as financial elder abuse. I asked him what the immediate recourse was. He took off his glasses, looking exhausted. You can petition the court for a formal, compulsory accounting. That legally compels her to produce records for every single transaction under oath within 30 days. If she fails to do so, and based on your data, she will fail. That failure is entered as formal evidence. At that point, it transitions from a civil matter to a criminal one. The state prosecutor gets involved. He looked at me intently. But you need to understand the personal cost, Julianne. This is your mother. If you initiate this process, there is no quiet way to withdraw. You could face the reality of sending your own mother to prison. Families do not recover from that. I thanked him and made the drive back, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. There was a legal pathway. It was clear, it was structured, and it went directly through my mother. And I wasn't entirely certain I possessed the strength to walk it. That evening, unable to sleep, I returned to the journal, reading further than I had before, into the final, agonizing pages where his hand could barely form the letters, and there tucked between 2 pages near the very back was a small, torn one piece of grid paper. On it, in his shaky watchmaker's hand, he had written 4 specific account numbers: his checking, his savings, an investment account, and a 4th number I didn't recognize. Beneath them, he had written a single sentence: "If you are reading this, quiet girl." Then I was right about them, and I am so sorry. I sat on the edge of our bed, staring at those words until they blurred. He had known. That was the detail that cut deeper than the vacation photo, deeper than the vacant chairs at his funeral. He had been fully aware of what his daughter was doing to him, and he had been physically too weak and legally too isolated to stop it. Instead of giving up, he had quietly constructed a case inside a wooden box and left it for the one person he trusted. He had used a scrap of grid paper to hand me the key, and his apology felt like a heavy weight on my chest. He was apologizing to me, as if her betrayal of him was somehow a burden he had placed on my shoulders, rather than a crime committed against us both. I smoothed out the paper. I knew exactly what he had left me. He hadn't left me a legacy of grief. He had left me instructions. 4 account numbers and a line of text from a man who was never wrong about people. I tucked the note into my wallet, and somewhere between that realization and the dawn, I stopped mourning and started calculating. He had kept those records for a reason. Now, I was going to finish the work. With that 4th account number, the entire puzzle clicked into place. That unrecognized account was a major certificate of deposit he had built steadily over 40 years. His life savings. The legacy he had intended to leave behind for something meaningful. I had Warren formally request the institutional records, added the CD data to my spreadsheet, and watched the total jump. She hadn't just drained his checking and savings. In his final, most vulnerable month, while he was physically incapable of signing his name, she had used her power of attorney to liquidate the CD early, absorbed the substantial penalty, and transferred the entirety of the funds south. I audited the figures 3 times because the final number seemed impossible. 482,000. That was the figure resting at the bottom of my spreadsheet. Over $480,000, systematically drained from a man who lived modestly, who wore the same worn coats for decades, because he believed good materials shouldn't be discarded. I thought of him sitting at his kitchen table, writing spent 500 on the 11th, bought nothing. Apologizing to himself in a diary for spending money he had never touched, and all the while, nearly $500,000 was being funneled away. I closed my laptop with deliberate gentleness. If I hadn't, I would have smashed it. I sat in the quiet of the dark house and let the anger turn into cold, absolute certainty. I had one final confirmation left to obtain. The piece that would turn my private ledger into an undeniable legal document. The first call came from my Uncle Thomas, Helen's younger brother. I made the mistake of hoping he would share my outrage. He had always been the gentler relative, the one who bought me books for my birthdays. He started with a soft, careful tone. He said he had heard I was upset about some financial matters regarding the estate. He understood. But did I really want to tear the family apart over Arthur's remaining assets? I told him it wasn't a dispute over the remaining assets. I told him Helen had systematically emptied his accounts while he was dying. $482,000, Thomas. I have the bank records. There was a long, cold pause on the line. I could almost hear his mind working, and it wasn't out of sympathy for his father. "Listen, Julianne," he said, his voice dropping its warm tone. "Whatever occurred, it needs to remain a family matter. If you take this to a courtroom, if you involve attorneys, there won't be anything left for anyone. Helen told me there was supposed to be a share allocated for me and your aunt. Don't ruin that for us." And there it was. He wasn't concerned about what had been done to Arthur. He was concerned about his portion of the spoils. He was standing in a burning house, begging me not to call the fire department because the water might ruin the furniture he wanted to salvage. "I love you, Thomas," I said quietly, and hung up the phone before I could say something irreversible. That was the first casualty, my own uncle. Choosing a payout over his father's memory, choosing his sister's silence over justice for a stolen life. I stood by the window and realized the harsh truth. This wasn't just me against my mother. This was me against an entire family system that viewed elder abuse as a private business transaction. I was entirely on my own. The betrayal that hurt the most, however, came from David. He handled the conversation carefully, the way you handle high-voltage wiring. "Julianne," he said softly, "I love you and I loved Arthur. But maybe we should just let this go." I stared at him, stunned. He kept going, his voice reasonable, calm, and entirely wrong. "It's not our money. It never was. If you go to war with Helen, it will drag on for years. It will cost us thousands in legal fees. And Maya is going to watch her mother consume herself over a dead man's bank account. He can't use that money now. Let's protect our peace and walk away." I knew he wasn't trying to be cruel. He was being a father, trying to build a shield between his family and a devastating conflict. But it felt like a knife in my back anyway, because the one person I assumed would stand beside me was asking me to yield. "It's not about the money, David," I whispered. "It was never about the money. It's about a man who showed up for every single event in my life, while his own daughter couldn't be burdened to attend his funeral because she was too busy spending what she stole from him. If I let this go, then standing by someone means absolutely nothing. Then love is just a word people use until the assets are distributed." He looked at me for a long time. He didn't agree. Not that night. He went upstairs to bed, and I remained at the table alone with my grandfather's journal, $500,000 in stolen funds, and not a single soul standing with me. And that was when I finally accepted what had to be done. She moved far quicker than I anticipated. A week after our conversation, I drove out to Arthur's house, perhaps just to sit on the steps we had stained. But when I pulled up, there was a prominent real estate sign hammered into the lawn and a lockbox secured to the doorknob. She had flown back, changed the locks, and listed his home for sale before the grass on his grave had even begun to take root. I stood in the driveway, where I had parked hundreds of times, locked out of the only place that had ever felt like a sanctuary. Inside, a light was on. I could see her silhouette moving behind the shears, packing up his remaining possessions. When she noticed my car, she walked to the window and deliberately drew the heavy curtains shut. She didn't open the door. She didn't call out. She simply shut me out of his life, as if I were a trespasser. I stood in the cold air until the porch light, the one he had kept burning for me for 27 years, clicked off. She turned off his light. That is the one detail that remains lodged in my mind. For nearly 3 decades, that light was my guide. And my mother reached out and extinguished it. I drove home, my jaw aching from how hard I was clenching my teeth. She was going to liquidate his home, pocket the cash, erase his memory, and dare anyone to challenge her, because who takes their own mother to court? She was betting everything on my lifelong habit of staying quiet to keep the peace. She made a fatal miscalculation. When her quiet actions didn't stop me, She tried a direct threat. Helen called me a few days later, her voice carrying that artificial, rehearsed calm that lawyers instruct their clients to use. She had learned I was consulting with elder law specialists. "I want you to think very carefully about your next move, Julianne," she said smoothly. "If you pursue this, I will make sure everyone knows the truth. I will tell the court and the community how you manipulated a dying, senile old man, how you forced your way into his home, poisoned his mind against his own daughter, and fabricated these financial records to secure an inheritance you have absolutely no biological claim to." She delivered the threat so seamlessly, I could tell she had practiced it in front of a mirror. "You have no idea how bad this will look for you," she added. "The charity, Case Grandchild, isolating a sick man and controlling his estate. You throw one stone, and I will throw 10. She was attempting to reverse the roles. In her narrative, the thief was the victim, and the granddaughter, who had provided daily care, was the predator. And the terrifying part was that I knew it could work on people who didn't know us. A judge doesn't see 25 years of quiet devotion. They see a disputed estate, a bitter family, and a lot of missing funds, and they form doubts. For an hour, I was genuinely afraid, not of her, but of the lies she was willing to tell. Then I remembered what I actually held in my hands. I didn't have a story. I didn't have a simple accusation. I had Arthur's actual journal, dated and written in his own hand, documenting the theft as it occurred. I had a fiduciary who couldn't account for a single transaction. I had numbers that didn't lie. Let her throw her stones. I held the truth. Warren referred me to an attorney named Sylvia Moreno, who specialized exclusively in elder financial abuse. She was the first person in weeks who looked at my spreadsheet and didn't hesitate. She reviewed the journal, the statements, and the power of attorney document in silence for 20 minutes. Then she removed her glasses and looked at me. "Julianne," she said, "most of these cases are incredibly messy. Missing records, fading memories, family members pointing fingers. This is different. Your grandfather did the investigative work for us. He documented his own exploitation in real time, and he left an undeniable paper trail." She outlined the strategy. First, we file the petition for a compulsory accounting. The court gives Helen 30 days to justify every single withdrawal under oath. When she fails to do so, it constitutes a clear breach of fiduciary duty, which carries civil penalties, restitution, and potentially double damages for bad faith. But because the amount exceeds the statutory threshold, and $482,000 is well past it, Sylvia added, this escalates from a civil lawsuit to a felony criminal charge of financial elder exploitation. That means a prosecutor, an arrest warrant, and significant prison time. She leaned forward. "You need to make a final decision before I file these papers, because once we initiate this, the court will not let us withdraw it. If the evidence holds, and it does, your mother is on a path that ends in handcuffs. You cannot undo this." I sat in the chair staring at the documents on her desk. The path was clear. It was paved, and it ran directly over my mother. I told Sylvia I needed 24 hours, and I meant it. That night was the most difficult night of my entire life. It was harder than the funeral. Because at the funeral I had no control, this was entirely my choice. I sat at my dining room table and felt the absolute weight of the pen. If I signed, my mother, the woman whose face I had searched for in every crowd and never found, would become a criminal defendant. She could spend years behind bars. Whatever tiny bond still connected us would be severed permanently, and I would be the one who cut it. There was a part of me, the 8-year-old child, who wanted to throw the papers away, apologize, and spend the rest of my life accepting whatever crumbs of affection she offered. I felt her pulling at me, begging me to keep the peace, to not make trouble, to remain small. And then I opened the journal to the passage I had memorized. Being there is the whole battle, quiet girl. And I finally realized I had understood those words backward my entire life. I had thought showing up meant staying quiet, enduring the pain, and keeping a false peace. But Arthur had never kept a false peace with the truth. He had stood by me, which meant he placed himself between me and the people who sought to harm me. Standing by someone isn't shrinking. It is standing firm. He had used his last remaining strength to stand up for me from inside a wooden watchbox. The absolute least I could do was stand up for him now. I closed the Navy journal. I let the 8-year-old child rest. And in the morning, I called Sylvia and told her to proceed. We filed the petition on a Thursday morning. I took a half day from work, sitting in Sylvia's office, as she presented the documents for my signature. Every signature felt like locking a door and throwing away the key. The petition for compulsory accounting, the formal report to Adult Protective Services, the detailed affidavit, my sworn statement with my signature at the bottom, testifying against my own mother. My hand remained perfectly steady, the watchmaker's granddaughter, using the accountant's precision. I didn't let my fingers shake. When it was finished, Sylvia compiled the papers into a blue folder. "You understand there is no turning back now," she said. "Once the court has this, it belongs to the state. Even if you want to drop the charges later, you won't have the legal authority to do so." "I understand," I replied, and I did. I understood that I had just, with my own signature, ended whatever semblance of family I had left. I understood that my uncle would never speak to me again, that my aunt would turn her back, and that many of the people I grew up with would view me as cold and ruthless. I drove home with my chest tight, terrified of the fallout. But beneath the fear was a sensation I hadn't experienced in 27 years. It took me miles to identify it. It was relief. The profound relief of a woman who has finally stopped begging for love that was never going to be given, and has chosen to stand on solid ground instead. The certified letter reached Helen on a Monday afternoon. She called me that very night. I let it ring through to voicemail, and then I forced myself to listen to the recording. The first 2 minutes were pure, unbridled fury. She called me a snake, a thief, a parasite who had crawled into Arthur's house and turned him against his actual family. She said I had always been envious, that Arthur should have left me on the street where he found me. I stood in my kitchen and listened to the vitriol, and it didn't pierce me. Somewhere along this journey, her anger had lost its power over me. Then, mid-sentence, her tone shifted completely. It was the fastest, most calculated transition I had ever heard. "Julianne, please." Her voice went soft, trembling with unshed tears. "We can resolve this. Family has to stick together. If you withdraw the petition, we can be a family again. Think of Maya. Doesn't your daughter deserve to have a grandmother in her life?" There it was, the ancient trap, the exact lure that would have captured me at any other point in my life. "You'll still have a mother." As if she had ever actually been one. As if the title were a prize she was offering rather than a responsibility she had abandoned decades ago. I deleted the voicemail. I did not reply. I knew, with absolute clarity, that she wasn't remorseful. She was trapped. And to a woman like Helen, those two feelings are identical. She would say anything to make the financial records disappear, but the records were no longer mine to control. They belonged to a judge now, and he was going to demand answers. The 30 days expired, and Helen's required accounting was submitted to the court. Just as Sylvia had predicted, it was insubstantial, evasive, and riddled with discrepancies. She had characterized the transfers as caregiver compensation and unspecified family loans, but produced absolutely no receipts, no signed agreements, and no authorization from Arthur. For a fiduciary, that isn't a legal defense, it is a written confession. In the weeks leading up to the court date, Sylvia, Warren, and I prepared our exhibits. We placed Arthur's journal entries side by side with the bank records, matching his handwritten notes to the exact transactions. 500 on the 11th, there it was on the bank ledger. 700 on the 18th, there it was. He hadn't just left me a diary. He had left an eyewitness deposition that the institutional data validated line by line. We constructed a simple, clear exhibit, his words on the left, the corresponding bank transactions on the right, and the cumulative total of a 482,000 at the bottom. Sylvia remarked that in 30 years of practice, she had rarely seen a more undeniable case of financial exploitation. I should have felt a sense of victory. Instead, I simply felt exhausted, sorrowful, and completely resolved. The night before the hearing, I prepared my clothes and read his final journal entry one last time. If you are reading this, quiet girl, then I was right about them. And I am so sorry. Then I turned off the lamp. The next day, I would sit in a courtroom and let his records speak for themselves. The probate courtroom was small, lined with dark oak paneling that Arthur would have appreciated for its fine grain. I sat at the petitioner's table with Sylvia. Warren sat directly behind us, and behind him in the public gallery sat the family. My Uncle Thomas, who refused to make eye contact, my aunt, a few cousins, all of them there to observe, and none of them standing with me. Then Helen and Victor entered, and I had to suppress a cold laugh because they had dressed specifically for the performance. She wore a tailored navy dress and pearl earrings, her skin still carrying that golden coastal tan, walking in with the posture of someone observing someone else's legal trouble. Victor followed behind, looking uncomfortable in an ill-fitting blazer. They had hired a prominent defense attorney, and the three of them sat down with the supreme confidence of individuals who had spent their lives avoiding accountability. The judge called the session to order. Sylvia presented our petition, and then Helen's attorney stood to present their defense. He did exactly what he was paid to do. He attempted to make the theft of 482,000 sound like a minor communication breakdown within a loving family. He spoke of the emotional toll of terminal illness, informal arrangements, and the complicated nature of elder care. He was highly articulate, but as he spoke, the judge kept looking down at our side-by-side exhibit, Arthur's faltering handwriting on the left, the bank's cold records on the right. I watched the judge's expression, and I knew that no amount of smooth talking or expensive tailoring was going to save them. You cannot charm a cumulative total. You cannot debate a spreadsheet. Helen had lived her entire life believing that a confident voice could alter the facts. And she was about to discover that in this room, the numbers had the final word. The judge called a brief recess before issuing his ruling. And that was when they made their final attempt. Helen's attorney approached Sylvia in the corridor and requested a private word with me. Against Sylvia's advice, I agreed to listen. The offer was highly strategic. Helen would return a portion of the funds, not the entire amount, but a significant share, And then came the leverage. She would sign the deed of Arthur's house back over to me. My home, the steps we stained, the star nightlight, the light she had turned off. In exchange, I would withdraw the criminal complaint, retract my affidavit, and sign a non-disclosure agreement. Keep it in the family. No trial, no record. And then Helen herself stepped into the corridor. She softened her expression, reached out her hand, and delivered the line she had prepared. "Take the house, quiet girl. Let's put this behind us. You'll still have a mother." And I stood there, feeling the precise weight of the trap. It was constructed out of everything I had spent my life wishing for: the home, peace, the illusion of a mother. Everything my 8-year-old self had cried for, offered to me in a courthouse hallway in exchange for my silence. All I had to do was remain quiet, accept the trade, and let her walk away. Keep the peace. I looked at her outstretched hand. I looked at Sylvia, who remained silent, leaving the choice entirely to me, and I saw two distinct paths ahead. One was warm, quiet, and built on a foundation of compromise, where I got the house but carried the lie. The other was cold, difficult, but clean, where I walked away with nothing but my word to a deceased man. My grandfather had stood by me for 25 years. The very least I could do was not sell him out in a hallway for a set of keys. "No," I said, just the one word, quietly, the way he had taught me to say the things that mattered. My mother's face went entirely pale, then twisted with rage. In her entire life, she had never offered a compromise and been met with a refusal. We returned to the courtroom. When Sylvia entered the exhibits into the formal record, I requested permission to address the court, and the judge granted it. I kept my voice calm and measured. I laid out the facts exactly as I would during a business audit. I read Arthur's own words first. "Money is disappearing, and I don't understand why. She thinks I am too weak to notice. I am not. I just have no way to stop her." Then I matched those words to the banking transactions, transfer by transfer, up to the liquidation of the CD while he was too ill to protect himself, culminating in the 482,000 total. I informed the court that these funds had never belonged to me and that I had no intention of claiming them. I explained that my grandfather had intended his life savings for something meaningful, and I asked the court to direct the recovered funds to an organization that cared for isolated elderly individuals who had no family to stand by them. And his house, the one she had attempted to liquidate, I would be donating to a local elder care charity in Arthur Vance's name. It was that specific declaration that broke her. Not the exposure of the theft, but the moment I gave the assets away. She stood up, shouting before her attorney could stop her. "It was owed to me!" she screamed at the bench. "It was mine! I earned it!" I dealt with that old man my entire life. The courtroom fell into an absolute silence. She had declared her intent directly to the judge. I simply looked at her, calm and resolved, and I realized that I had won and lost the exact same thing in the same moment. I had preserved my grandfather's honor, and I had permanently severed my connection to my mother. Both outcomes occurred simultaneously. That is the price of standing up. The judge did not require much time to deliberate. He ruled that Helen had committed an egregious breach of her fiduciary duties, utilizing the power of attorney solely for her own enrichment. He ordered full restitution of the $482,000, and because of the clear evidence of bad faith, he assessed double damages. Then, he issued the order that could not be retracted. He referred the entire matter to the county prosecutor for criminal prosecution of felony financial exploitation of an elder. I watched the reality of the ruling settle on her. The tailored navy dress and the coastal tan lost all their significance. Victor, my father, who had happily joined her on that resort beach, visibly leaned away from her, his mind already calculating how to secure a plea deal for himself. He had always traveled light, and I knew he would cooperate with the prosecution the moment they offered him a terms sheet. Helen looked at me across the courtroom, and for a fraction of a second, her composure fractured. I saw fear, real unvarnished fear. The panic of a woman who believed her entire life that she could talk her way out of any consequence, realizing she had run out of words. I didn't celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate. Instead, I looked past her to the vacant chair at our table where Warren had placed Arthur's navy blue journal. And I whispered a quiet message just for him. Numbers don't grieve. They simply tell the truth. He had kept his logs to his very last breath so that one day a courtroom would be forced to listen to his voice, and they had. The community had arrived for his memorial, and now the justice system had heard his final testimony. The man who had always stood by me had finally had his day in court. She confronted me on the courthouse steps afterward. Victor had already departed to find his own representation. Helen approached me, her voice low and trembling with venom. "I hope you're satisfied," she hissed. "You have destroyed this family. You took everything from me. You were never one of us anyway." I stood on those stone steps in the cold afternoon air, and for the first time in 34 years, I felt absolutely nothing. No fear, no desire for her validation, no lingering hope of being accepted. I looked at my mother and replied, "I didn't take anything from you. You took it from him." I simply compiled the ledger. I told her calmly that I would not be speaking to her again, that she was never to contact me or Maya, and that any future communication would go through my legal counsel. I established the boundary clearly, like closing a balanced account. She opened her mouth to speak, but found she had nothing left to say. For once in her life, Helen Mercer was completely silent. I walked down the steps and did not look back, and the overwhelming feeling was one of profound lightness, not joy. You do not find joy at the end of a conflict like this, but absolute freedom. Free of a debt I had spent my entire life trying to settle with a woman who was never going to market paid. I got in my car. David was waiting for me at home, and I drove toward the people who actually stand by me. The final resolution arrived in the slow, unglamorous manner of the legal system. Helen accepted a plea agreement to avoid a jury trial and served a prison sentence for felony elder financial abuse with compulsory restitution. Victor cooperated fully with the state, testified against her, and walked away with probation and a permanently tarnished reputation. My Uncle Thomas chose his silence, and it cost him a niece. We have not spoken since the hearing, and I have made my peace with that loss. The doubled restitution funds were recovered over the following year. I did not keep a single dollar. Every cent, along with the liquidated value of the CD, was placed into a private foundation I established, the Arthur Vance Foundation for Elder Support, dedicated to assisting isolated seniors who have no family to protect them. It funds transportation for medical care and provides companions to sit with them in their times of need. And his home, the place she had tried to sell, was transferred to the charity, ensuring that the house where a young girl had once been given a star nightlight would continue to offer shelter to those who have no one else. My mother had called me a charity case. I smile now whenever I sign a check from that foundation, because in a way she was right. I was raised by charity, the genuine kind that shows up, stands firm, and remains. On the day we formally transferred the deed to the charity, I took David and Maya out to the house one last time. David had understood my decision long before the legal proceedings concluded. He told me later that watching me reject the house in that corridor was the moment he realized he had married a woman with a spine made of the same resilient material as her grandfather. He held my hand as we stood on the porch. Maya, now 6 years old and completely fearless, ran through the tall grass of the yard just as I had decades ago. The porch light was burning. I had driven out the previous week, replaced the bulb, and left it turned on. We sat together on the top step, and I opened the navy blue journal to its final page. I read my daughter the last sentence her great-grandfather had ever written. If you are reading this, quiet girl, then I was right about them. And I am so sorry. Maya looked up and asked why he was apologizing. I told her the truth. He was sorry that the people who should have loved him hadn't stood by him. Then I closed the cover and told her the more important truth. That one man had stood by me my entire life, and his devotion was the reason her mother knew how to stand firm. She is only 6, so she didn't fully comprehend it. But she will inherit the journal one day, and she will understand then. Here is the single truth I know with absolute certainty now: love is not what is written in a will. It is not an image posted on a social media feed, or a card that arrives late in the mail. Love is the person who sits in the chair when the room is empty, and there is nothing left to gain. My grandfather sat in that chair for me, and in the end, the only thing he ever required of me was to stand up for him the way he had stood up for me. Being there is the entire battle. 2 vacant chairs, a photograph from a resort, a Navy journal in a watchmaker's box. That was the shape of betrayal in my family, and standing firm against it is what finally set me free. If there is someone in your life who has always stood by you, go tell them today before the chairs are empty. And if this story resonated with you, subscribe to their secret stories and stay with us. There are more women here who have stopped shrinking. Perhaps you will be the next.